The origins of the Jewish people trace back to the ancient Israelites and Hebrews of historic Israel and Judah, two closely related kingdoms that emerged in the Levant during the Iron Age. One of the earliest known references to the Israelites appears on the Merneptah stele, dated to around 1213-1203 BCE. Religious traditions, however, extend their story even further, reaching back to approximately 1500 BCE. According to tradition, the name Israel is linked to the patriarch Jacob, who after wrestling with a divine being was given the name Israel, meaning one who struggles with God. This story became a foundational element of Jewish identity and heritage. Over time, these early kingdoms faced powerful empires. The kingdom of Israel, centered in Samaria, fell to the Neo-Assyrian Empire around 720 BCE. Later, in 586 BCE, the kingdom of Judah was conquered by the Neo-Babylonian Empire. A significant portion of the population was exiled to Babylon, marking the beginning of what is known as the Jewish Diaspora, a dispersion that would shape Jewish history for millennia. Following the rise of the Achaemenid Empire, exiled Jews were allowed to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This marked the beginning of the Second Temple period, a time of religious renewal and reconstruction. Centuries later, the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucid Empire led to the establishment of an independent Hasmonean kingdom. However, this independence was eventually overshadowed by the expansion of Roman power. In the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, a series of revolts against Roman rule, known as the Jewish-Roman Wars, ended in devastation. Jerusalem and the Second Temple were destroyed, and many Jews were expelled. Over time, the Jewish population in the region declined, and the center of Jewish life gradually shifted away from Judea to places like Galilee and Babylon, while smaller communities spread throughout the Roman Empire. During this period of dispersion, key religious texts such as the Mishnah and the Talmud were compiled, preserving Jewish law, tradition, and identity. Over the centuries, Jewish communities formed distinct cultural identities based on geography. The Ashkenazim in Central and Eastern Europe, the Sephardim in Iberia, and the Mizrahim across the Middle East and North Africa. The rise of Islamic empires in the 7th and 8th centuries reshaped the region. Under Muslim rule, especially in medieval Spain, Jewish culture experienced a golden age, flourishing in intellectual, cultural, and economic life. However, this period of tolerance ended with the rise of more rigid regimes like the Almohads. In 1492, Jews were expelled from Spain, prompting large migrations to the Ottoman Empire and Italy. Meanwhile, Jewish communities in Central Europe faced waves of persecution between the 12th and 15th centuries, leading many Ashkenazi Jews to migrate eastward, particularly to Poland. The 18th century saw the emergence of the Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment, which encouraged education, reform, and integration into broader European society. At the same time, Jews increasingly advocated for emancipation and equal rights. By the 19th century, Jews in Western Europe were gaining legal equality, but those in Eastern Europe, especially within the Pale of Settlement, continued to face severe restrictions and violent pogroms. These hardships fueled both mass migration and the rise of a new political vision, Zionism. Founded officially in 1897, the Zionist movement aimed to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Between 1881 and 1924, over 2 million Jews emigrated to the United States, while others moved toward Ottoman Syria. Despite adversity, Jewish communities made profound contributions to science, philosophy, culture, and economics. Figures such as Albert Einstein and Ludwig Wittgenstein became globally recognized, and Jewish individuals earned a remarkable number of Nobel Prizes. However, the 20th century brought unprecedented tragedy. In 1933, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in Germany, ushering in a regime defined by racial antisemitism. As persecution intensified, many Jews fled Europe. With the outbreak of World War II in 1939 and Germany's rapid expansion, millions fell under Nazi control. In 1941, the Nazis initiated the Final Solution, a systematic plan to annihilate the Jewish people. This led to the Holocaust, during which approximately 6 million Jews were murdered in ghettos, mass shootings, and extermination camps. In Poland alone, millions perished, including over 1 million at Auschwitz. This genocide remains one of the darkest chapters in human history. Before and during the Holocaust, many Jews migrated to mandatory Palestine. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel, a Jewish and democratic state in the historic land of Israel. Almost immediately, neighboring Arab nations launched attacks, but the newly formed Israeli forces resisted. By 1949, the war ended, and Israel began building its state while absorbing large waves of Jewish immigrants from Europe and the Middle East. Today, Israel stands as a parliamentary democracy with a population of around 9.6 million people, including approximately 7 million Jews. Outside Israel, the largest Jewish community resides in the United States, with significant populations in countries such as France, Canada, Argentina, Russia, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Germany. In addition to Israel, the Jewish Autonomous Oblast also exists as a designated Jewish region. The history of the Jewish people is preserved through a rich tapestry of sources: the Hebrew Bible, ancient inscriptions, writings by historians like Josephus, Greco-Roman accounts, and archaeological discoveries such as the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Cairo Geniza. These are further complemented by oral traditions and religious commentaries like the Midrash and the... With the advent of the printing press in the early modern period, Jewish historical writing expanded significantly. Scholars began documenting not only religious history, but also national identity, culture, and collective memory. Over time, Jewish historiography evolved, influenced by movements such as the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, while still rooted in ancient traditions. Today, Jewish history is commonly divided into 7 major periods: the era of ancient Israel and Judah, the Second Temple period, the Rabbinic Age, the Middle Ages, the Early Modern Era, the Modern Period, and finally, the Age of Zionism, the Holocaust, and the establishment of the State of Israel. Ancient Israel, 1500 to 586 BCE. Early Israelites. The story of the early Jewish people unfolds in one of the most historically rich regions on earth, the Fertile Crescent, stretching between the Nile River and Mesopotamia along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. This land, known as Canaan, roughly corresponding to modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon, stood at the crossroads of great civilizations. Surrounded by the ancient powers of Egypt and Babylonia, bordered by the deserts of Arabia and the highlands of Asia Minor, it became a meeting ground of cultures, trade, and ideas. The earliest known reference to a people called Israel appears on the Merneptah stele of ancient Egypt, dated to around 1200 BCE. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Israelites emerged from within the Canaanite population itself, gradually developing a distinct identity. Central to this identity was the evolution of a unique religious belief, first monolatry and later full monotheism, focused on the worship of Yahweh. They spoke an early form of Hebrew, now known as Biblical Hebrew. For centuries, Jewish understanding of their origins was shaped by the narratives of the Hebrew Bible. According to this tradition, Abraham is regarded as the first Jew, the founding patriarch and father of the faith. His son Isaac and grandson Jacob continued this lineage. After a mysterious struggle with a divine being, Jacob was renamed Israel, giving rise to the name of an entire people. The biblical account continues with Jacob's descendants, the 12 tribes of Israel, who migrated to Egypt during a time of famine. There, they eventually fell into slavery, only to be led to freedom by Moses in a dramatic exodus. After years of wandering in the wilderness, they entered and settled in Canaan under the leadership of Joshua. Modern scholarship, however, presents a more complex picture. Archaeological evidence overwhelmingly suggests that the Israelites were largely indigenous to Canaan, rather than migrants from Egypt. Many scholars find no direct evidence supporting a mass exodus or prolonged desert journey. Instead, early Israelite society appears to have developed gradually within Canaanite culture. Their settlements, pottery, and even religious artifacts closely resemble those of their Canaanite neighbors, with one notable distinction: the near absence of pig remains in Israelite sites, though its significance remains debated. According to biblical tradition, the early Israelites were organized as a loose confederation of 12 tribes, governed by leaders known as judges for several centuries. Ancient Israel and Judah, by the Iron Age too, two distinct kingdoms had emerged: the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. While the Bible describes these as successors to a once united monarchy, modern historians debate whether such a unified kingdom truly existed in the form described. What is widely accepted, however, is the historical existence of both kingdoms. The kingdom of Israel is believed to have existed from around 900 BCE, while the kingdom of Judah emerged slightly later, around 700 BCE. Archaeological discoveries such as the Tel Dan Stele provide evidence that supports the existence of a ruling dynasty linked to the House of David by the mid-9th century BCE. Biblical tradition recounts that the Israelite monarchy began with Saul, followed by King David, who expanded the kingdom and captured Jerusalem, transforming it into a political and spiritual capital. His son Solomon further strengthened the kingdom and built the first temple in Jerusalem, a central place of worship that would define Jewish religious life for centuries. After Solomon's death around 930 BCE, internal divisions led to a dramatic split. The 10 northern tribes formed the Kingdom of Israel, while the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin established the Kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel quickly became more powerful and prosperous. Under the Omride dynasty, it controlled key regions such as Samaria, Galilee, and parts of Transjordan. Its capital, Samaria, housed one of the most impressive palaces of the Iron Age Levant. However, this strength did not last forever. Around 720 BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire conquered and destroyed the kingdom. In contrast, the kingdom of Judah, centered in Jerusalem, controlled the Judean highlands, the Shephelah, and parts of the Negev desert. After Israel's fall, Judah became a vassal state under Assyrian dominance. Despite political pressure, it experienced population growth and economic stability, even as its king, Hezekiah, led a failed revolt against the Assyrian ruler Sennacherib. This period was also a time of intense literary and religious activity. Significant portions of the Hebrew Bible were composed, including writings attributed to prophets such as Isaiah, Amos, and Micah, along with early historical texts and legal codes that would shape Jewish identity. Fall of Judah and the Babylonian captivity. The decline of Judah began with the fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire around 600 BCE, which triggered a power struggle between Egypt and the rising Neo-Babylonian Empire for control of the Levant. Caught in the middle, Judah's position became increasingly fragile. King Jehoiakim initially submitted to Babylon, but later rebelled, setting off a chain of events that would lead to disaster. His son Jehoiachin briefly continued the resistance, but was soon forced to surrender in 597 BCE. He was taken captive to Babylon, as recorded in the Babylonian Chronicles. The Babylonians then installed Zedekiah as a puppet king. After Solomon's death around 930 BCE, internal divisions led to a dramatic split. The 10 northern tribes formed the Kingdom of Israel, while the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin established the Kingdom of Judah. The northern Kingdom of Israel quickly became more powerful and prosperous. Under the Omride dynasty, it controlled key regions such as Samaria, Galilee, and parts of Transjordan. Its capital, Samaria, housed one of the most impressive palaces of the Iron Age Levant. However, this strength did not last forever. Around 720 BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire conquered and destroyed the kingdom. In contrast, the Kingdom of Judah, centered in Jerusalem, controlled the Judean highlands, the Shephelah, and parts of the Negev desert. After Israel's fall, Judah became a vassal state under Assyrian dominance. Despite political pressure, it experienced population growth and economic stability, even as its king, Hezekiah, led a failed revolt against the Assyrian ruler, Sennacherib. This period was also a time of intense literary and religious activity. Significant portions of the Hebrew Bible were composed, including writings attributed to prophets such as Isaiah, Amos, and Micah, along with early historical texts and legal codes that would shape Jewish identity. Fall of Judah and the Babylonian captivity. The decline of Judah began with the fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire around 605 BCE, which triggered a power struggle between Egypt and the rising Neo-Babylonian Empire for control of the Levant. Caught in the middle, Judah's position became increasingly fragile. King Jehoiakim initially submitted to Babylon, but later rebelled, setting off a chain of events that would lead to disaster. His son Jehoiachin briefly continued the resistance, but was soon forced to surrender in 597 BCE. He was taken captive to Babylon, as recorded in the Babylonian Chronicles. The Babylonians then installed Zedekiah as a puppet king. When Zedekiah also rebelled, Babylon responded with overwhelming force. In 587 or 586 BCE, King Nebuchadnezzar II laid siege to Jerusalem. The city was destroyed, and the first temple was burned to the ground. Sacred treasures were looted, and much of the population was deported to Mesopotamia. This event marked the beginning of the Babylonian captivity, a turning point in Jewish history. The people of Judah lost not only their kingdom, but also their political independence. Their homeland was transformed into a province of the Babylonian Empire, and their identity was reshaped in exile. Yet even in displacement, the foundations of Jewish continuity were strengthened through memory, tradition, and faith. Babylonian captivity. C. 587-530 8 BCE. The destruction of Jerusalem and Solomon's temple marked one of the most defining turning points in Jewish history. In the aftermath, large segments of the Judean population were deported to Babylon, while others scattered across regions such as Elam and Egypt. Some remained in the devastated land of Judah, struggling to rebuild amidst ruin. This period, often described as an obscure phase, was anything but silent. The prophet Jeremiah records the presence of Jewish communities in Egypt, including settlements in Migdol, Tahpanhes, Noph, and Pathros. At Elephantine, a Jewish military colony had already been established, complete with its own temple, evidence of how Jewish identity adapted even in foreign lands. When Zedekiah also rebelled, Babylon responded with overwhelming force. In 587 or 586 BCE, King Nebuchadnezzar II laid siege to Jerusalem. The city was destroyed, and the first temple was burned to the ground. Sacred treasures were looted, and much of the population was deported to Mesopotamia. This event marked the beginning of the Babylonian captivity, a turning point in Jewish history. The people of Judah lost not only their kingdom, but also their political independence. Their homeland was transformed into a province of the Babylonian Empire, and their identity was reshaped in exile. Yet even in displacement, the foundations of Jewish continuity were strengthened through memory, tradition, and faith. Babylonian captivity, c. 587–530 8 BCE. The destruction of Jerusalem and Solomon's temple marked one of the most defining turning points in Jewish history. In the aftermath, large segments of the Judean population were deported to Babylon, while others scattered across regions such as Elam and Egypt. Some remained in the devastated land of Judah, struggling to rebuild amidst ruin. This period, often described as an obscure phase, was anything but silent. The prophet Jeremiah records the presence of Jewish communities in Egypt, including settlements in Migdol, Tahpanhes, Noph, and Pathros. At Elephantine, a Jewish military colony had already been established, complete with its own temple, evidence of how Jewish identity adapted even in foreign lands. Far from disappearing, Jewish religious life evolved in exile. Foundational texts were expanded, edited, and composed. During this time, portions of Deuteronomy were refined, and prophetic works such as Ezekiel, Obadiah, and what scholars call Second Isaiah emerged. In exile, the seeds of spiritual resilience were planted, transforming loss into identity. Second Temple period, 538 BCE to 70 CE. Persian period, c. 538–332 BCE. A new chapter began when Cyrus the Great of the Achaemenid Empire conquered Babylon in 538 BCE. In a remarkable shift of imperial policy, he allowed the exiled Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. Led by Zerubbabel, a descendant of King David, and Joshua the high priest, the returning exiles undertook the reconstruction of Jerusalem's sacred center. Between 521 and 516 BCE, the Second Temple was completed, restoring a focal point of worship and national identity. Yet, this return was gradual. Many Jews chose to remain in exile, while those who returned formed a smaller, restructured community in a Persian province known as Yehud. Archaeological evidence suggests that the population was modest, perhaps around 30,000 people, far smaller than in the days before the exile. During this period, the Torah likely reached its final form, becoming the central foundation of Jewish law and life. Ezra, a key religious leader, is traditionally credited with its public proclamation. The last prophets of the Hebrew tradition, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, also lived during this era, marking the closing chapter of classical prophecy. As time passed, leadership transitioned to scholarly figures, laying the groundwork for future religious movements. Groups such as the Pharisees and Sadducees began to take shape, reflecting evolving interpretations of faith and law. Hellenistic period, c. 330 to 110 BCE. In 332 BCE, the world changed again with the arrival of Alexander the Great, who defeated the Persians and brought Greek influence to the region. After his death, his empire was divided, and Judea fell under the rule of the Seleucid kingdom. Greek culture, language, and philosophy began to blend with Jewish traditions, especially among diaspora communities in cities like Alexandria. This fusion gave rise to new intellectual developments, including the translation of Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the Septuagint. Thinkers such as Philo of Alexandria sought to harmonize Jewish theology with Hellenistic philosophy, creating a unique synthesis of faith and reason. Hasmonean dynasty, 110 to 63 BCE. Tensions between traditionally Jewish practices and Hellenistic influence eventually erupted into conflict when Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV imposed harsh anti-Jewish decrees. A rebellion broke out in 167 BCE. Led by Mattathias and his son Judas Maccabeus, the revolt achieved a stunning victory. In 164 BCE, Jerusalem was recaptured, the temple was purified, and Jewish worship was restored. This triumph is commemorated in the festival of Hanukkah. The success of the revolt led to the establishment of an independent Jewish state under the Hasmonean dynasty. For nearly a century, this kingdom combined religious and political authority, expanding its territory through both warfare and diplomacy. Under rulers like Alexander Jannaeus and Salome Alexandra, the kingdom reached its height. However, internal divisions soon weakened it. A civil war between rival heirs, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, invited outside intervention. Rome stepped in, and in 63 BCE, General Pompey conquered Jerusalem, bringing Jewish independence to an end. Roman period, 63 BCE, 135 CE. With Roman conquest, Judea entered a new and turbulent era. Initially governed as a client state, it later became a formal Roman province. Herod the Great, appointed King of the Jews by Rome, ruled with ambition and grandeur, overseeing massive building projects, including the expansion of the Second Temple. After his death, Roman control tightened. By 6 CE, Judea was governed directly by Roman officials. Tensions between Roman authority and Jewish society steadily escalated, fueled by heavy taxation, cultural clashes, and religious sensitivities. It was during this period that Jesus of Nazareth, a Jewish teacher from Galilee and central figure of Christianity, was crucified in Jerusalem under the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. Resistance eventually erupted into open revolt. In 66 CE, the First Jewish-Roman War began. Roman forces, led first by Vespasian and later by his son Titus, crushed the rebellion. In 70 CE, Jerusalem fell. The city was burned, and the Second Temple, once the heart of Jewish life, was destroyed. The consequences were catastrophic. Vast numbers of Jews were killed, enslaved, or displaced. The war ended with the fall of Masada in 73 to 74 CE, symbolizing the final collapse of organized resistance. Talmudic period, 70 to 640 CE, the Diaspora Revolt, 115 to 117 CE. In the early 2nd century CE, Jewish communities scattered across the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire rose in a wave of rebellion known as the Diaspora Revolt. From Egypt to Cyprus and Libya, these uprisings were fueled by deep resentment, religious tension, and a powerful hope the return to Zion and the rebuilding of the temple. Ancient accounts describe the violence of the revolt in extreme terms, though modern historians believe some of these descriptions may be exaggerated. What remains undeniable, however, is the scale of the Roman response. The suppression was swift and ruthless. Entire Jewish communities were devastated, particularly in Alexandria, Cyprus, and North Africa, where centuries-old centers of Jewish life were nearly wiped out. The Bar Kokhba Revolt, 132 to 136 CE. A few years later, rebellion erupted once again, this time in the heart of Judea. The Bar Kokhba Revolt was triggered by Emperor Hadrian's decision to transform Jerusalem into a Roman pagan city called Aelia Capitolina. Under the leadership of Simon Bar Kokhba, a charismatic and determined figure, the rebels achieved early success. For a brief moment, an independent Jewish state was reborn. Coins minted during this period boldly declared freedom of Israel and for the freedom of Jerusalem, reflecting a powerful national revival. But Rome would not tolerate defiance. Massive legions were deployed, and the counterattack was devastating. Strongholds were destroyed, villages erased, and hundreds of thousands perished. The land of Judea was left scarred and depopulated. In the aftermath, Jews were banned from entering Jerusalem. The province itself was renamed Syria Palestina, a deliberate attempt to erase Jewish ties to the land. This defeat marked the end of ancient Jewish statehood, a reality that would persist for nearly 2 millennia. Talmudic period, 70 to 640 CE, the Diaspora Revolt, 115 to 117 CE. In the early 2nd century CE, Jewish communities scattered across the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire rose in a wave of rebellion known as the Diaspora Revolt. From Egypt to Cyprus and Libya, these uprisings were fueled by deep resentment, religious tension, and a powerful hope: the return to Zion and the rebuilding of the temple. Ancient accounts describe the violence of the revolt in extreme terms, though modern historians believe some of these descriptions may be exaggerated. What remains undeniable, however, is the scale of the Roman response. The suppression was swift and ruthless. Entire Jewish communities were devastated, particularly in Alexandria, Cyprus, and North Africa, where centuries-old centers of Jewish life were nearly wiped out. The Bar Kokhba Revolt, 132 to 136 CE. A few years later, rebellion erupted once again, this time in the heart of Judea. The Bar Kokhba Revolt was triggered by Emperor Hadrian's decision to transform Jerusalem into a Roman pagan city called Aelia Capitolina. Under the leadership of Simon Bar Kokhba, a charismatic and determined figure, the rebels achieved early success. For a brief moment, an independent Jewish state was reborn. Coins minted during this period boldly declared freedom of Israel and for the freedom of Jerusalem, reflecting a powerful national revival. But Rome would not tolerate defiance. Massive legions were deployed, and the counterattack was devastating. Strongholds were destroyed, villages erased, and hundreds of thousands perished. The land of Judea was left scarred and depopulated. In the aftermath, Jews were banned from entering Jerusalem. The province itself was renamed Syria Palestina, a deliberate attempt to erase Jewish ties to the land. This defeat marked the end of ancient Jewish statehood, a reality that would persist for nearly 2 millennia. A changing religious landscape. With political independence lost, Jewish life turned inward. During this period, the foundations of Rabbinic Judaism were solidified. The destruction of the temple had already shifted religious focus away from sacrifice toward prayer, study, and community. A key figure of this era, Yohanan ben Zakkai, is remembered for preserving Jewish scholarship by establishing a center of learning in Yavne. Over time, the traditions of the Pharisees became dominant, while other sects, such as the Sadducees and Essenes, faded into history. Although later mystical traditions would attribute the authorship of the Zohar to Rabbi Simeon Bar Yochai, modern scholarship places its composition much later, in medieval Spain. Late Roman rule in the land of Israel, relations between Jews and the Roman, later Byzantine, authorities remained tense and complex. Under Emperor Constantine, Jews were permitted to mourn the destruction of the temple annually at the Western Wall, but broader restrictions remained. Further unrest erupted in Galilee in the mid-4th century, leading to harsh reprisals. However, a brief moment of hope appeared under Emperor Julian, who sought to revive non-Christian religions and even ordered the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. His sudden death ended these ambitions, and Christian dominance was soon reasserted. Later attempts by Jewish communities to reclaim religious space in Jerusalem were met with resistance. Even when restrictions were briefly lifted, tensions with the growing Christian population led to violence and expulsion. Meanwhile, the region witnessed other upheavals, including Samaritan revolts, which were brutally suppressed. In the early 7th century, Jews allied with the Persian Empire during its invasion of Byzantine territory, briefly gaining control of Jerusalem. However, this autonomy was short-lived, and violence soon followed, forcing many Jews to flee once again. By 637 CE, the region passed into Muslim control under Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, marking the end of Byzantine rule and the beginning of a new era, Babylonia, the new center of Jewish life, 219 to 638 CE. As the land of Israel declined as a political and demographic center, Babylonia rose to prominence. Jewish life there had deep roots, dating back to the Babylonian exile centuries earlier. Over time, it became the heart of Jewish intellectual and spiritual activity. By the early century CE, Babylonia was home to one of the largest Jewish populations in the world, possibly numbering in the millions. Thriving communities developed in major cities, forming a vibrant and influential diaspora. It was here that one of Judaism's most important achievements took shape, the Babylonian Talmud. Written in Hebrew and Aramaic, it became the cornerstone of Jewish law, ethics, and tradition. At the center of this intellectual life were the great academies, especially those at Sura and Pumbedita. These institutions, led by scholars known as the Geonim, became the guiding authority for Jewish communities across the world. Their teachings shaped religious life for centuries and established traditions that continue to this day. Other centers of learning flourished in places like Nehardea and Mahuza, creating a vast network of scholarship. These academies functioned much like the ancient Sanhedrin, providing religious leadership and legal interpretation for the Jewish world. Even under changing empires, from the Sassanid Persians to the Islamic Caliphate, these institutions endured. For nearly 450 years, the Geonim served as the spiritual leaders of global Jewry, while the Exilarch, believed to be descended from ancient kings, held secular authority in Babylonian society. Enduring legacy for Jews of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, Babylonia was more than a place of exile. It was a center of renewal. The traditions developed there, especially the study of the Talmud in academies known as yeshivot, became the foundation of Jewish education worldwide. From Babylon to Europe, North Africa, and eventually the Americas, this model of learning spread across the diaspora, ensuring that even without a homeland, Jewish identity remained strong, unified, and enduring. Byzantine period, 324–638 CE, as the Roman Empire transformed into the Byzantine Empire. The Jewish presence across the Mediterranean world continued, but under increasingly difficult conditions. While Jewish communities remained widespread, their influence and status gradually declined under a system shaped by militant Christianity and imperial control over religion. The Byzantine state actively promoted the conversion of Jews to Christianity. Religious authority and political power worked hand in hand, placing continuous pressure on Jewish communities. In 351 CE, rising tensions led to a Jewish revolt against the rule of Constantius Gallus. The rebellion was swiftly crushed, and key centers of Jewish life in Galilee, such as Tzipori and Lydda, were devastated, never fully recovering their former prominence. Intellectual resilience and religious development, despite political hardships, Jewish scholarship continued to evolve. In Tiberias, the respected leader Hillel II introduced a standardized calendar system, eliminating the need for monthly lunar observations. This innovation allowed Jewish communities across the diaspora to maintain a unified religious schedule without reliance on a central authority in Judea. At the same time, scholars in Tiberias compiled one of Judaism's most important texts, the Jerusalem Talmud. This monumental work brought together generations of teachings, interpretations, and debates built upon the Mishnah, preserving the intellectual. Enduring legacy for Jews of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, Babylonia was more than a place of exile. It was a center of renewal. The traditions developed there, especially the study of the Talmud in academies known as yeshivot, became the foundation of Jewish education worldwide. From Babylon to Europe, North Africa, and eventually the Americas, this model of learning spread across the diaspora, ensuring that even without a homeland, Jewish identity remained strong, unified, and enduring. Byzantine period, 324–638 CE, as the Roman Empire transformed into the Byzantine Empire. The Jewish presence across the Mediterranean world continued, but under increasingly difficult conditions. While Jewish communities remained widespread, their influence and status gradually declined under a system shaped by militant Christianity and imperial control over religion. The Byzantine state actively promoted the conversion of Jews to Christianity. Religious authority and political power worked hand in hand, placing continuous pressure on Jewish communities. In 351 CE, rising tensions led to a Jewish revolt against the rule of Constantius Gallus. The rebellion was swiftly crushed, and key centers of Jewish life in Galilee, such as Tzipori and Lydda, were devastated, never fully recovering their former prominence. Intellectual resilience and religious development, despite political hardships, Jewish scholarship continued to evolve. In Tiberias, the respected leader Hillel II introduced a standardized calendar system, eliminating the need for monthly lunar observations. This innovation allowed Jewish communities across the diaspora to maintain a unified religious schedule without reliance on a central authority in Judea. At the same time, scholars in Tiberias compiled one of Judaism's most important texts, the Jerusalem Talmud. This monumental work brought together generations of teachings, interpretations, and debates built upon the Mishnah, preserving the intellectual and spiritual legacy of Jewish law, moments of hope and renewed restrictions. A brief period of hope emerged under Emperor Julian, often called Julian the Apostate, who sought to revive traditional Roman religions. He permitted Jews to attempt the rebuilding of Jerusalem and even supported plans to reconstruct the temple. However, his sudden death in 363 CE brought these ambitions to an abrupt end, and Christian dominance was quickly restored. From the late 4th century onward, hostility intensified. Influential church leaders, such as John Chrysostom, delivered harsh sermons against Jews, contributing to a climate of distrust and hostility in major cities like Antioch and Constantinople. Legal restrictions and social pressures. By the 5th century, imperial policies under Emperor Theodosius formalized discrimination. Jews faced severe legal limitations. They were forbidden from building new synagogues, holding public office, or marrying outside their faith. Converting Christians to Judaism was punishable by death. Later, under Emperor Justinian, restrictions deepened further. Jewish religious practices were interfered with directly, including limitations on the use of Hebrew in worship. In some cases, synagogues were seized or converted into churches, and communities were forced into conversion. Cultural flourishing amid hardship. Yet even under pressure, Jewish cultural life endured. In fact, the 5th and 6th centuries saw the construction of new synagogues, many adorned with intricate mosaic floors. These artworks reflected both Jewish identity and the influence of Byzantine artistic styles. Remarkable mosaics, featuring menorahs, biblical scenes, animals, and even zodiac symbols, have been discovered in places such as Beit Alpha, Tiberias, Beit Shean, and Tzipori. These works stand as powerful evidence of a community that continued to create, adapt, and express its identity despite adversity. The end of Byzantine rule. The Byzantine era came to a dramatic close in the 7th century with the rapid expansion of the Muslim Caliphate. After the decisive Battle of Yarmouk in 636 CE, Byzantine control over the Levant collapsed. As Muslim rule spread across the region, many Jews migrated from Byzantine territories into lands under the Caliphate, where conditions were often comparatively more stable. This transition marked the beginning of a new historical chapter for Jewish communities in the Middle East. Jewish life beyond the empire. Beyond the core Byzantine territories, Jewish communities continued to flourish in distant regions. In southern India, the Cochin Jewish tradition traces its origins back to the arrival of Jewish settlers after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. According to local accounts, Jewish communities were granted a degree of autonomy by regional rulers, allowing them to establish a lasting presence. Similarly, in the highlands of East Africa, the Kingdom of Semine in present-day Ethiopia emerged as a unique Jewish polity, enduring for centuries until the early modern period. Enduring presence despite political restrictions, religious pressures, and shifting empires. Jewish communities during the Byzantine period demonstrated remarkable resilience. Their intellectual achievements, cultural expressions, and global presence ensured that Jewish identity not only survived, but continued to evolve across continents. Medieval period. Islamic era, 638, 1099. The year 638 CE marked a turning point. The Byzantine Empire lost control of the Levant, and a new power emerged, the Islamic Caliphate under Caliph Umar. Jerusalem, along with vast regions including Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, came under Muslim rule. For Jewish communities, this transition brought a significant shift. Under Islamic governance, Jews were granted the status of protected communities, allowing them to practice their religion while contributing to society. After nearly 500 years of exclusion, Jews were once again permitted to live in Jerusalem. In Jewish tradition, Caliph Umar is often remembered as a just and benevolent ruler, even described as a friend of Israel. Jewish life began to flourish across the Islamic world. In cities, Jews worked as bankers, craftsmen, merchants, and officials. During the Fatimid period, some even held influential positions within government. At the time of the Arab conquests, much of the population in these regions was still Christian or Jewish, highlighting the diverse cultural fabric of the early Islamic world. Babylonia, a center of learning. During this era, Babylonia became the intellectual heart of Judaism. The great academies, known as yeshivat, produced leading scholars called the Geonim, whose authority in Jewish law was recognized across the diaspora. New economic policies, such as the Karaj land tax, encouraged migration from rural areas to growing cities like Baghdad. This shift not only increased Jewish prosperity, but also exposed scholars to broader intellectual currents. Thinkers like Saadia Gaon engaged deeply with philosophy, bridging Jewish thought with wider intellectual traditions. As the Abbasid Caliphate declined, many Jews migrated westward, spreading Babylonian traditions across the Mediterranean world and unifying Jewish culture across distant regions. Golden Age in Islamic Spain, 711 to 1031. One of the most remarkable chapters in Jewish history unfolded in Muslim-ruled Spain, known as Al-Andalus. Here, during the Middle Ages, Jewish life entered a true golden age. Under rulers such as Abd al-Rahman III and his successor Al-Hakam II, Jewish communities thrived. They participated fully in society, contributing to commerce, governance, and intellectual life. Jewish scholars translated important works between Arabic, Hebrew, and emerging Romance languages, preserving and expanding knowledge across cultures. Jewish contributions extended across disciplines: medicine, mathematics, philosophy, poetry, and geography. Influential figures such as Hasdai ibn Shaprut supported scholars and helped elevate Jewish thought to new heights. This period produced some of the greatest minds in Jewish history, including Samuel Hanagid, Judah Halevi, Solomon ibn Gabirol, and the legendary Moses Maimonides. Cordoba, in particular, became a vibrant center of learning, attracting scholars from across the world. Although Jews lived under certain social restrictions, these were often symbolic rather than oppressive, allowing a relatively stable coexistence. However, this golden age eventually came to an end with the rise of the Almohads, a more rigid and intolerant dynasty from North Africa. Jews in the Crusades, 1090 to 1260. While Jewish communities flourished in parts of the Islamic world, a very different reality unfolded in Christian Europe during the Crusades. Beginning in the late 11th century, crusading fervor swept across Europe. Calls to reclaim the Holy Land were often accompanied by violent anti-Semitism. Before even reaching the Middle East, crusaders turned their fury on Jewish communities in Europe, particularly in cities along the Rhine River. Massacres spread rapidly. Entire communities were destroyed in places like Rouen and Heidelberg. Jews faced a terrible choice: forced conversion, death, or suicide to avoid baptism. Many chose death, driven by the fear that their children would be taken and raised as Christians. These events marked a dark turning point. Trust between Jewish communities and their Christian neighbors shattered. The massacres are often seen as the beginning of a long chain of persecution that would echo through centuries. The fall of Jerusalem. 1099. The Crusaders captured Jerusalem. Jewish residents who had fought alongside Muslim defenders sought refuge in synagogues, but many were burned alive when the buildings were set on fire. Despite these tragedies, Jewish communities continued to exist across the region. in cities such as Tiberias, Ramleh, Ashkelon, and Gaza. Unable to own land under Crusader rule, many Jews turned to trades and crafts, working as artisans, merchants, and specialists. Cultural and spiritual continuity. Even in times of hardship, Jewish intellectual life endured. In Tiberias, scholars known as the Masoretes developed the Nikud system, diacritical marks used to preserve the correct pronunciation of Hebrew texts. This innovation ensured the accurate transmission of sacred scriptures across generations. Religious poetry, piyutim, and interpretive literature, midrashim, also flourished, reflecting a deep spiritual resilience. Voices of faith and longing. Throughout this period, Jewish thinkers and poets expressed a powerful longing for their ancestral homeland. Moses Maimonides, one of the greatest Jewish philosophers, visited Jerusalem in 1165 and recorded the moment as deeply sacred, so much so that he established annual personal commemorations of his prayers at holy sites. Similarly, the poet Judah Halevi famously left Spain in search of Zion. According to tradition, as he approached Jerusalem and sang of his yearning, he was tragically killed, symbolizing both the devotion and the vulnerability of his people. Enduring through adversity, the medieval period reflects a striking contrast in Jewish history, an era of intellectual brilliance and cultural flourishing in the Islamic world, alongside persecution and violence in parts of Christian Europe. Yet, through both prosperity and suffering, one constant remained: resilience. Jewish communities adapted, rebuilt, and carried their identity forward across continents, cultures, and centuries. Mamluk period, 1260 to 1517. Following the decline of Crusader control, the Mamluks established their rule over the Levant. During this period, Jewish life in the Holy Land remained fragile, yet not entirely extinguished. Small communities persisted, and in time, signs of renewal began to emerge. One of the most significant figures of this era was Nabonidus, a renowned Jewish scholar and philosopher. In 1267, he arrived in Jerusalem and settled in its old city. What he found was a city in ruins, desolate, nearly abandoned, with only 2 Jewish residents remaining, both working as dyers. Despite these conditions, Nabonidus began rebuilding Jewish intellectual life. He gathered students, taught Torah, and attracted listeners even from distant regions such as the Euphrates. His influence extended beyond rabbinic circles. Members of the Karaite community are said to have attended his teachings as well. In letters to his family, Nabonidus described the sorrowful state of Jerusalem, while also emphasizing moral values such as humility and devotion. His efforts marked the beginning of a slow but meaningful revival of Jewish presence in the land. After his death, he was buried in Haifa, near the grave of Yechiel of Paris. Scholars and renewal, Yechiel of Paris had arrived earlier in 1260, bringing with him a group of followers. In Acre, he established a major Talmudic academy, helping preserve Jewish scholarship during a time of instability. Centuries later, in 1488, another important figure, Obadiah ben Abraham, arrived in Jerusalem. His presence symbolized a new phase of return as Jewish communities slowly began to reestablish themselves in their ancestral homeland. Jewish life across regions, Spain, North Africa, and the Middle East. During the medieval period, Jewish experiences varied greatly depending on location. In many Islamic lands, Jews were treated comparatively better than in Christian Europe, although they were still considered second-class citizens. In Muslim Spain, Jewish life reached extraordinary heights during what is often called a golden age. Jews held influential roles in courts, contributed to science and philosophy, and played a vital part in trade and administration. However, this stability was not permanent. Waves of violence, including riots and forced conversions, occurred in regions such as Morocco, Algeria, and Yemen. In some areas, Jews were forced into segregated quarters or faced harsh choices between conversion and death. The rise of the Almohads, a strict and intolerant dynasty, brought further hardship. Many Jews fled, some moving deeper into the Islamic world, while others sought refuge in emerging Christian kingdoms of Europe. Europe in the Middle Ages, Jewish communities had existed in Europe since Roman times, and by the early Middle Ages, they were firmly established in regions such as France, Germany, and Spain. Contrary to popular belief, the early medieval period was not uniformly hostile. Between 800 and 1100, Jewish communities often lived under the protection of kings and local rulers. They played essential roles in finance, medicine, and administration, which granted them a degree of security. However, this protection came at a cost. Jews remained politically vulnerable and were frequently subjected to heavy taxation and exploitation. As the influence of the church grew stronger, attitudes began to shift. Rising persecution and expulsions. By the late Middle Ages, hostility intensified. Religious tensions, fueled by church teachings and public performances like passion plays, painted Jews as enemies of Christianity. This led to increasing discrimination, violence, and eventual expulsions. Jews were often barred from many professions, which led them to specialize in moneylending, an occupation forbidden to Christians at the time. While this made them economically significant, it also made them targets of resentment. Massacres and forced expulsions became more frequent. Jews were expelled from England in 1290, from France in 1396, and from Austria in 1421. Many migrated eastward, particularly to Poland, where they found relative stability and prosperity. Ghettos and social isolation. In parts of Europe, especially Italy, Jews were confined to designated areas known as ghettos. These segregated districts limited movement and reinforced social divisions. Jews were also required in some regions to wear identifying markers such as yellow badges, further isolating them from the wider population. The catastrophe in Spain and Portugal, one of the most devastating events of the medieval period, occurred in Spain. Once home to one of the largest and most vibrant Jewish communities in the world, Spain became the center of intense persecution in the late 14th and 15th centuries. In 1391, violent pogroms swept across Spanish cities, forcing many Jews to convert to Christianity. These converts, known as conversos, often continued practicing Judaism in secret, risking severe punishment from the Inquisition. In 1492, after the fall of Granada, Spain's last Muslim kingdom, the Catholic monarchs issued the Alhambra Decree. Jews were given a stark choice: convert or leave. Around 100,000 Jews were expelled, while many others converted under pressure. Portugal followed with similar measures in 1496. Families were torn apart, children were taken, and entire communities were uprooted. The expelled Jews, known as Sephardim, spread across the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and parts of Europe. Cities like Thessaloniki became major centers of Sephardic life, preserving their language, traditions, and culture. Enduring legacy. The medieval period stands as a time of stark contrasts in Jewish history, marked by both intellectual brilliance and profound suffering. From the quiet rebuilding efforts in Jerusalem under the Mamluks to the flourishing Golden Age in Spain and the tragedies of persecution and exile in Europe, Jewish communities demonstrated remarkable endurance. Despite displacement, hardship, and loss, they carried forward their identity, knowledge, and faith, laying the foundations for the modern Jewish world. Early modern period. Historians of modern Jewry identify four major paths through which European Jews entered modernity and gradually integrated into broader European society. One of the most common interpretations frames this transformation through the lens of the Enlightenment, a period that presented both opportunity and challenge for Jewish communities seeking political emancipation and social acceptance. Two key social archetypes often illustrate this transformation. The first is the court Jew, a figure who emerged as a precursor to the modern Jewish experience. Court Jews were financiers, advisors, and intermediaries who successfully integrated into the economic and political structures of powerful European courts, particularly within empires such as the Habsburg Empire. They operated within elite circles, participating in early capitalist systems and gaining influence far beyond traditional communal boundaries. In contrast, stands the maskil, the intellectual product of the Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment. The maskilim pursued secular knowledge and applied rational thought to religious tradition, often challenging long-established rabbinic authority. Their ideas laid the intellectual groundwork for the transformation of Jewish life, encouraging cultural assimilation, educational reform, and the eventual emergence of movements such as Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, and early forms of Zionism. While the Haskalah emphasized modernization and integration, another powerful movement, Hasidic Judaism, emerged in opposition. It promoted spirituality, mysticism, and emotional religious expression, resisting the rationalism of Enlightenment thought. By the late 20th century, historians introduced an alternative model known as the Port Jew. Unlike the Ashkenazic, German-centered narrative of modernization, the Port Jew represented Sephardic merchants and refugees who fled the Inquisition and settled in major maritime cities such as Amsterdam, London, and Hamburg. These individuals thrived in global trade networks and embodied a flexible cosmopolitan identity that bridged cultures, religions, and economies. Court Jews. Court Jews were Jewish bankers, merchants, and diplomats who provided essential financial services to European nobility. Often referred to historically as Jewish bailiffs or Stadlanim, they played a critical role in sustaining royal economies. They extended loans to rulers, supplied armies with provisions, facilitated trade, and acted as diplomatic agents. In return, they were granted privileges rarely available to other Jews, including permission to live outside ghettos and, in some cases, elevation to noble status. Their unique position allowed them to act as intermediaries between Jewish communities and ruling authorities. They could advocate for Jewish interests and offer protection to their communities. However, their status remained precarious. If a patron lost power or died, the court Jew could face exile, imprisonment, or even execution, and their wealth could be confiscated. Port Jews. The concept of the Port Jew describes Jewish merchants deeply engaged in maritime trade during the 17th and 18th centuries. Many were Sephardic Jews or descendants of conversos who had fled persecution in Spain and Portugal. Settling in key port cities such as Amsterdam, London, Trieste, and Hamburg, they became vital to the economic success of these regions. Their extensive diaspora networks enabled them to dominate international trade routes, particularly in commodities like chocolate and vanilla. Unlike traditional Jewish communities, Port Jews often exhibited a more flexible religious identity and a pragmatic approach to cultural integration. Their cosmopolitan lifestyle represented a distinct path into modernity, one driven by commerce rather than ideology. The Ottoman Empire. During the height of the Ottoman Empire, Jewish communities experienced periods of remarkable prosperity. Compared to many parts of Christian Europe, the empire offered relative tolerance under the millet system, which allowed religious minorities to govern their internal affairs. In the 16th century, Jews played prominent roles in trade, diplomacy, and administration. A notable example is Joseph Nasi, who rose to the position of governor of the island of Naxos, an extraordinary achievement for a non-Muslim. In the empire, cities such as Safed became major centers of Jewish learning and spirituality. It was here that foundational texts like the Shulchan Aruch were compiled and Kabbalistic thought flourished. The region also saw the introduction of early Hebrew printing presses. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire served as a refuge for Jews fleeing persecution in Europe, particularly after the expulsions from Spain and Portugal, Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, and beyond. By the 17th century, Poland-Lithuania had become home to the largest Jewish population in Europe. For several centuries, Jews in this region enjoyed relative autonomy and prosperity. However, this stability was shattered during the Khmelnytsky Uprising of 1648, when Cossack forces massacred hundreds of thousands of Jews. This catastrophe, followed by further conflicts such as the Swedish Wars, led to widespread devastation and displacement. As a result, many Jews migrated westward, particularly to cities like Amsterdam, seeking safety and new opportunities. Over time, political changes, including the partitions of Poland, placed large Jewish populations under the control of the Russian Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Prussia, fundamentally reshaping Jewish life in Eastern Europe. European Enlightenment and Haskalah. 18th century. During the era of the European Enlightenment, profound transformations reshaped Jewish life across the continent. Parallel to this broader intellectual awakening emerged the Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment, a movement that sought to open the doors of European society to Jewish communities while reforming Jewish culture from within. For the first time in centuries, Jews began to actively campaign for civil rights, emancipation, and social integration. Traditional religious education was gradually expanded to include secular subjects such as science, philosophy, and modern languages. Alongside this shift came a renewed interest in Jewish history and the Hebrew language, fostering an early sense of cultural and national identity. Among the leading thinkers of this movement were Moses Mendelssohn, Naphtali Herz-Wesley, Isaac Satanow, and Isaac Ushel. Their writings and ideas laid the intellectual foundation for modern Jewish thought. The Haskalah not only reshaped education and identity, but also gave rise to major religious transformations. It inspired the development of Reform and Conservative Judaism, while simultaneously planting the early ideological seeds of Zionism. At the same time, it encouraged Jews to assimilate culturally into the nations in which they lived. Hasidic Judaism, a spiritual counter-movement. Almost simultaneously, a powerful spiritual revival emerged in Eastern Europe, Hasidic Judaism, founded by Israel Baal Shem Tov. In contrast to the rationalism of the Haskalah, Hasidism emphasized deep spiritual connection with God, joyful worship, and emotional devotion. The belief that divine presence exists in all aspects of life. Rather than focusing solely on scholarly study, Hasidism elevated the spiritual value of ordinary people, teaching that sincerity and faith were just as important as intellectual achievement. Its gatherings were filled with song, storytelling, and communal prayer, creating a vibrant religious culture rooted in mysticism and emotional expression. This movement stood in ideological opposition to Enlightenment ideals, yet both together shaped the modern divisions within Judaism, including Orthodox, Hasidic, and Reformist traditions. The debate over emancipation. As these internal transformations unfolded, Europe itself was changing. The question of Jewish equality became central to political debate. The turning point came with the French Revolution, when France became the first country to grant Jews full civil rights. However, this emancipation came with a condition. Jews were expected to abandon their collective identity and integrate fully as individuals. This tension was famously captured by Stanislas de Clermont-Tonnerre, who declared that Jews should be granted everything as individuals, but nothing as a separate nation. His words reflected a broader European dilemma. Acceptance came at the cost of cultural distinctiveness. 19th century. Emancipation and transformation. The 19th century marked a period of rapid change. Across Europe, legal barriers were gradually dismantled, and Jews gained the right to own land, enter public service, participate in political life. Under the influence of Napoleon Bonaparte, many Jews left the ghettos and entered mainstream society, benefiting from laws that promoted equality. This newfound freedom allowed Jews to thrive in various fields, including banking and finance, law and medicine, and literature. One of the most influential figures of this era was Mayer Amschel Rothschild, whose banking empire became synonymous with financial power across Europe. The Rothschild family would go on to build one of the most powerful financial networks in history. Economic growth and social change. In Eastern Europe, particularly within the Russian Empire and Galicia, Jewish life followed a different path. Many Jews remained engaged in small-scale trade, craftsmanship, and commerce. However, the rise of industrialization brought new challenges. Small Jewish businesses declined. Factories replaced traditional workshops. Jews were often excluded from industrial employment. This led to increased political awareness and organization. In 1897, Jewish workers formed the General Jewish Labor Bund, advocating for workers' rights and social equality. The rise of modern anti-Semitism. Despite growing integration, a new and more dangerous form of anti-Semitism emerged in the 19th century. Unlike earlier religious hostility, this new ideology was based on race and nationalism. Jews were increasingly portrayed as a separate and inferior race, particularly in parts of Western and Central Europe. This racial anti-Semitism fueled political movements in countries such as France, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. One of the most infamous examples was the Dreyfus Affair, in which a Jewish officer was falsely accused of treason, exposing deep-rooted prejudice within European society. Mass migration and a new beginning, facing persecution and limited opportunities, millions of Jews sought a new future abroad. Between 1890 and 1924, over 2 million Jews migrated to the United States, escaping hardship in Eastern Europe. At the same time, Jewish communities also grew in South America, particularly in Argentina. Uruguay. These migrations marked the beginning of a new global Jewish presence, one less constrained by the restrictions that had defined life in Europe for centuries. 20th century. The rise of modern Zionism. By the late 19th century, a powerful new idea began to take shape among European Jews, the vision of returning to their ancestral homeland and rebuilding a nation. This movement, known as Zionism, transformed Jewish history in the modern era. During the 1870s and 1880s, Jewish communities across Europe increasingly discussed migration to Ottoman Syria, with the goal of re-establishing a Jewish presence in Palestine and fulfilling ancient hopes of return, often associated with the concept of Shevet Zion. In 1882, one of the first modern Jewish settlements, Rishon LeZion, was established by pioneers from a Hovei Zion movement. Soon after, the Bilu movement followed, founding additional agricultural communities across the region. The movement gained formal structure with the Katowice Conference and, more significantly, the First Zionist Congress. At the center of this transformation stood Theodor Herzl, whose vision of a Jewish state galvanized international support and political action. World War I and the promise of a homeland. The outbreak of World War I reshaped the political map of the Middle East. Following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Britain took control of Palestine. In 1917, a pivotal moment arrived with the Balfour Declaration, which promised the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. This declaration, associated with Chaim Weizmann, gave Zionism international legitimacy. By 1920, the British Mandate for Palestine was established, with Herbert Samuel as its first High Commissioner. During this period, institutions such as the Hebrew University of Jerusalem were founded, symbolizing the intellectual and cultural revival of Jewish life. Rising tensions and conflict. As Jewish immigration increased, tensions with the Arab population intensified. Many local Arabs opposed both the growing Jewish presence and British policies supporting it. In response to insecurity and recurring violence, Jewish communities began forming self-defense organizations such as Bar Giora, Hashomer. Eventually, larger paramilitary groups emerged, including Haganah, Irgun. Clashes escalated through major Guthantanau such as Nebi Musa riots, Jaffa riots, Arab revolt in Palestine. These conflicts involved Arabs, Jews, and British forces, creating a cycle of violence and mistrust. Gradually, Britain began reconsidering its support for a Jewish homeland, exploring alternatives such as a binational state or an Arab-majority state with a Jewish minority. Jews in Europe and America. After World War I, the aftermath of World War I brought profound change to Jewish communities, especially in Eastern Europe. The Russian Revolution and the rise of the Soviet Union disrupted traditional Jewish livelihoods. Private trade was restricted, forcing many Jews, long active in commerce, into new professions. In countries such as Poland, Hungary, and Romania, governments adopted policies aimed at excluding Jews from economic life, further limiting opportunities. Achievement amid adversity. Despite these challenges, Jews made extraordinary contributions across multiple fields. In countries like Germany and Austria, Jews were disproportionately represented among doctors, lawyers, and academics, artists, writers, and intellectuals, financial and commercial leaders. One of the most iconic figures of this era was Albert Einstein, whose work revolutionized modern science. Another was Ludwig Wittgenstein, a key figure in modern philosophy. Jewish individuals also earned a significant number of Nobel Prize honors, reflecting their impact on global knowledge and innovation. A world on the edge. By the early 20th century, Jewish history stood at a crossroads. On one side, there was integration, intellectual achievement, and global influence. On the other, rising nationalism, economic exclusion, and modern anti-Semitism were creating new dangers. At the same time, the Zionist dream was gaining momentum, setting the stage for one of the most consequential transformations in modern history. The Holocaust. Darkness descends on Europe. In 1933, With Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rising to power in Germany, life for Jews became increasingly perilous. Economic crises, discriminatory racial laws, and the looming threat of war forced many Jews to flee, seeking refuge in Palestine, the United States, and the Soviet Union. By 1939, World War II engulfed Europe. Germany occupied almost the entire continent, including Poland, home to millions of Jews, and France. In 1941, following the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Nazis implemented the final solution, a systematic campaign to annihilate the Jewish people. This genocide targeted Jews across Europe and even in North Africa, including Vichy North Africa and Italian Libya. Approximately 6 million Jews were murdered with unprecedented cruelty, a tragedy remembered as the Holocaust or Shoah, Hebrew, catastrophe. In Poland alone, as many as 1 million Jews were killed in the gas chambers of the Auschwitz concentration camp. The horrors of the Holocaust shocked the world and galvanized efforts to create a secure homeland for the Jewish people. The birth of the State of Israel. After 1945, Jewish resistance organizations in Palestine united to form the Jewish Resistance Movement, JRM, engaging in guerrilla actions against both Arab paramilitary forces and the British authorities. Following events such as the King David Hotel bombing, Chaim Weizmann appealed to the movement to halt military activity until decisions could be made by the Jewish Agency. While groups like the Haganah largely complied, Irgun and Lehi continued independent operations. Focus shifted toward illegal immigration. Jewish refugees from Europe were brought to Palestine without British approval. This immigration bolstered settlements, influenced global public opinion, and ultimately forced the British to defer the decision to the United Nations. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 181, II, recommending the partition of Palestine into an Arab state, a Jewish state, and an internationalized Jerusalem. While the Jewish leadership accepted the plan, Arab states and Palestinian Arabs rejected it, triggering a civil war that soon escalated into the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Proclamation and early conflicts. On May 14, 1948, after the final British forces departed, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel in Eretz Israel. The war ended in 1949, and Israel began absorbing hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants from Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Since its founding, Israel has faced recurring conflicts, including 1956 Suez Crisis, 1967 Six-Day War, 1973 Yom Kippur War, 1982 Lebanon War. Alongside these, ongoing minor clashes and a decades-long struggle over Palestinian territories have led to a series of largely unsuccessful peace initiatives involving Israel, Palestinian organizations, neighboring countries, the United States, and the European Union. Jewish life and Israel in the 21st century. Today, Israel is a parliamentary democracy with a population exceeding 8 million, of whom approximately 6 million are Jewish. The largest Jewish communities exist in Israel and the United States, while significant populations also reside in France, Argentina, Russia, England, and Canada. A unique experiment in Jewish self-governance continues in the Jewish Autonomous Oblast in Russia, created during the Soviet era. Today, it remains an autonomous region within the Russian Federation. The chief rabbi of Birobidzhan, Mordecai Shiner, reports a local Jewish population of about 4,000. Governor Nikolai Mikhailovich Volkov has pledged support for Jewish, cultural, and community initiatives. In 2004, the Birobidzhan Synagogue opened, marking the 70th anniversary of the region's founding. In Europe, the Jewish population in England and Wales grew slightly between 2001 and 2011, largely due to higher birth rates among the Haredi Jews. By 2011, the British Jewish population was estimated at 263,346, rising to 271,327 by 2021, according to the British Census. Conflict and contemporary challenges. On October 7, 2023, Israel faced a devastating attack by Hamas and other Palestinian militant organizations from the Gaza Strip. The assault claimed 1,139 lives, marking it as the deadliest day in Israel's history, and the deadliest for Jews globally since the Holocaust. The attack quickly escalated into a major conflict between Israel and Hamas. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were displaced, and over 250 hostages, including both Israelis and foreign nationals, were taken by Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other militant factions. Currently, 2006, tensions between Israel and Iran have escalated into a direct armed conflict that began on the 28th of February, 2026, when Israel, in coordination with the United States, launched airstrikes on Iranian military and strategic targets, including sites in and around Tehran. An offensive Israel terms Operation Lion's Roar. In retaliation, Iran has responded with ballistic and missile strikes against Israeli territory, causing civilian casualties and damage despite Israel's advanced defense systems. And the war has spread regionally through proxy engagements such as Iranian-aligned militias in Lebanon and other fronts. The conflict reflects decades of deep rivalry over security, nuclear ambitions, and regional influence, and remains ongoing, with both sides sustaining military and civilian losses amid wider diplomatic efforts to de-escalate.